Shalom. Shmi Philip. That's Hebrew for, hi, my name is Philip. Welcome to another episode in our occasional series examining various rather bizarre, currently held doctrines of Jehovah's Witnesses. These are doctrines that are on the books. They are current doctrines. They've never been disavowed or canceled, but they are some of the odder doctrines of Jehovah's Witnesses. And today, as you might have guessed, we're going to be discussing the topic that after Armageddon in paradise, everybody on earth will be speaking Hebrew. I was a little bit up in the air whether to make a video about this because it's not quite as bizarre as some of the other teachings we've discussed in the past, like that everybody will be a single gender in paradise and will be celibate for eternity. But I thought it was worth talking about because it is kind of an unusual doctrine. I don't really know off the top of my head if there's any other religions that teach this. When in the 90s, I feel like this was a pretty well-known doctrine among Jehovah's Witnesses. But for folks that have converted or been born into the religion in, say, the past 20, 30 years, I'm not sure if this is such a well-known thing to them. I guess I'd be curious to, if you have time, put in the comments roughly when you were in the religion and how familiar you were with this teaching that everybody will speak Hebrew in paradise. So the witness religion arrives at this idea that everybody will be speaking Hebrew kind of with two main factors. So the first thing is that they take everything that the Bible says has happened in the past, and then they just kind of play the tape in reverse. And so anything that happened after the Garden of Eden, it will revert back to how God originally set it up there. And so that's how we know what paradise will be like. And they use that for quite a few different things about paradise. And then the second factor is they consider anything in the Bible that's written as literal history to truly be literal historical events, that those things really happened exactly when and as the Bible says they did. And specifically here, we're talking about the events, the story of the Tower of Babel. Witnesses hold that that is a real historical event that definitely happened, 4,000 years ago. And that explains why there's all the languages on earth today. Before that, there was only a single language, is their belief. And more specifically, witnesses believe that Adam and Eve spoke Hebrew in the Garden of Eden. So let's look at a couple of references about that. So this is a 1974 Watchtower. It says, "What was the one original language? It was undoubtedly what later came to be called Hebrew." In the Insight book, Volume 1, talking about events in the Garden of Eden, it says, "Jehovah provided Hebrew as a perfectly satisfactory means of communication between God and men, as well as among humans." So let's look at how they arrive at this conclusion that Adam and Eve spoke Hebrew. Again, we'll go back to the Insight book, Volume 1 here, and this is what it says. "The Bible is the only historical source giving reliable evidence of the origin of the language that we know as Hebrew. It was, of course, spoken by the Israelite descendants of Abram the Hebrew, who in turn was descended from Noah's son Shem. In view of God's prophetic blessing on Shem, it is reasonable to believe that Shem's language was not affected when God confused the language of the disapproved people at Babel. Shem's language would remain the same as it had been previously, the one language that had existed from Adam onward. This would mean that the language that eventually came to be called Hebrew was the one original tongue of mankind. As stated, secular history knows no other." We see this reiterated in a 1991 Watchtower. It says, "Yes, human speech is a divine gift, for God gave the first man, Adam, a language. It was evidently the one eventually called Hebrew. That language was spoken by the Israelite descendants of Abram the Hebrew, a faithful patriarch whose ancestor Shem was a son of the ark builder Noah. In view of God's prophetic blessing on Shem, it is reasonable to conclude that his language was not affected by something Jehovah God did miraculously 43 centuries ago. Talking about the Tower of Babel story. This is from the Insight Book, Volume 2. Up until some point after the global flood, all mankind continued to be of one language, literally lip, and of one set of words. The Bible indicates that the language later called Hebrew was that original one language. As will be shown, this does not mean that all other languages stemmed from and are related to Hebrew, but that Hebrew preceded all other languages. This is from the All Scripture Inspired book on page 8. To Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and the Hebrew prophets, Jehovah spoke in mankind's first language, now known as Hebrew. And later on in the SI book, page 306, what men today call the Hebrew language was, in its original form, the language that Adam spoke in the Garden of Eden. For this reason, it could be referred to as man's language. It was the language spoken in Noah's day, though with a growing vocabulary. In still further expanded form, it was the basic language that survived when Jehovah confused mankind's speech at the Tower of Babel. Okay, so that's the basic doctrine of how God gave Adam and Eve the Hebrew language, and then how it survived down through the global flood. Noah and his family were speaking Hebrew, and then it survived through Shem's line through the Tower of Babel account. And so that brings us to the idea that Jehovah's Witnesses teach that mankind will return to speaking one single language around the globe. And why do they believe this? Well, a couple of reasons. Again, that idea of they're going to play the tape in reverse. And if we rewind through the Tower of Babel and the flood and get back to Adam and Eve, well, we'd be back at speaking a single language in the Garden of Eden. The second reason I would say is that they believe, understandably, I think it makes sense, that a single language would make it easier to have global unity. And then the third reason I was thinking is that confusion of languages at the Tower of Babel was basically a punishment to the people there. And so in the future, God will remove that punishment, since only good people are going to be on the earth after Armageddon, and they don't deserve that punishment still, so he'll remove it. And that's a point that was made in a 1974 Watchtower. It says, it would be very illogical to suppose that the kingdom would leave a barrier to communication in God's righteous new order, a barrier that he created for rebellious people to safeguard and restrain them from full unity in a bad activity. So let's go ahead and look at a couple references mentioning this idea that mankind will return to speaking one language in paradise. So this is a 1973 Watchtower. It says, it seems reasonable to conclude that at that time all faithful mankind will be united not only by the bonds of pure worship, but also by the further blessing of a single language for all peoples, understood by all and made possible by the heavenly kingdom rule of the grand creator of language, Jehovah. This is from a 2000 Awake magazine. Even now, a pure spiritual language, the truth about Jehovah God and his purposes, is uniting millions of people from all languages, nationalities, and former religions. Thus, it would seem logical that in his new world, God would further unite mankind by providing all peoples with one common language, reversing what he did at Babel. This is a 2013 Watchtower article. It says, this pure language, the truth from God's word, draws together a people from around the world today. It seems logical that in the future, God would unite mankind further by giving them one common language, undoing the confusion at Babel. Okay, so we definitely see the doctrine that we'll return to one language after Armageddon. Now, can we find where it says that that one language will be Hebrew? Let's check out some references. So this was a book published in 1986, Worldwide Security Under the Prince of Peace. It says, Will the earthwide paradise suffer from the confusion of having many languages? No, because the Prince of Peace is also referred to as the mighty God. Thus, he is able to reverse the confusion of language that began at the Tower of Babel. What will become the common language of all the earthly children of the Eternal Father? Will it be the original language of the first Adam, the language with which Jehovah endowed him? Likely. In any event, all language barriers will be wiped out. You will be able to travel anywhere and communicate with people. You will be able to understand them, and they will be able to understand you. There will be one language for all mankind, and it would be appropriate for the entire Bible to be available in that language. In that language, all the earth will be filled with the knowledge of Jehovah as the waters are covering the very sea. So it mentions we'll be returning to the language that Adam spoke, and as we've already seen, that language was Hebrew, according to Jehovah's Witnesses. Another reference. This is from a 1977 book, Our Incoming World Government, God's Kingdom. The world government takes away all language barriers between its subjects. National pride of language is wiped out. National distinctions are gone. No one is a citizen of this or that nation. All are world citizens, yes, citizens of one new world. The one language that they all speak for mutual understanding is the language recognized and used by the world government, the official language. It is mankind's original language, which everybody on earth spoke for the first 1800 years of human existence. That original language was developed to a high degree, and it never did really die out, for a small minority of people persisted in its use, also the greatest book on earth preserving it. Our next reference is from a 1974 Watchtower. This was kind of a longer article with the title, How One Language Will Bring Unity to Mankind. So we'll just look at a couple excerpts from it here. It says, when we examine God's original purpose concerning man's language, it becomes clear that he will have but one language spoken during Christ's 1,000-year rule. God wanted man to communicate. He himself spoke to Adam and arranged for Adam to talk to him. It goes on, what was the one original language? It was undoubtedly what later came to be called Hebrew. It continues, of course, after the exile of Israel to Babylon in 607 BCE, and right on down to our modern times, the Hebrew language has been influenced by other languages. 2. The exact pronunciation of God's name as spelled out in the Hebrew of Moses' day is not now known. But God can easily restore the purity of the language so that those living in the new order will speak it naturally and fluently. And the last excerpt, think also of being able to read for yourself exactly what the Hebrew prophets wrote in their own language. And one more reference, this is the 1973 book, God's Kingdom of 1,000 Years Has Approached. This is kind of interesting because it discusses a little bit about how everybody will learn Hebrew. Will it just be implanted into our brains, or what's the deal? So let's see. In harmony with his original purpose, God will bring mankind as a whole back to the one family language, the language with which he endowed mankind's first human father, only with a far larger vocabulary, possibly with embellishments from other languages that God invented at the Tower of Babel. For those who lived prior to the flood, including the 8 human survivors of that Noachian deluge, this will present no great problem at their resurrection from the dead to life on earth under God's millennial kingdom. But for the vast majority of the rest of mankind, it will mean learning a new language, the language God purposes for all humankind. In view of good language instructors used by the kingdom, there should be no great problem on this account. Even resurrected babies can be taught the new language from infancy. In this way, they will all be able to communicate with one another directly, with full understanding of one another's language terms and expressions. What a unifying effect this will have on the human family. Think of their all being able to read the inspired Hebrew scriptures, each one for himself, and to observe how all its prophecies have come true, and how it also contains an accurate historical account down to the days of the prophet Malachi. So here we learn that, we are indeed going to have to take language classes, basically, and learn Hebrew from scratch, just the old-fashioned way. There is an interesting footnote on this paragraph. It says, "This does not mean, however, that the one universal language of God's new order of things will be printed and written in the present-day square-style Hebrew alphabetic letters. Even today, there are extant Hebrew publications that are spelled out in the Latin-style alphabetic letters used in the English language." And it mentions a few examples there. So this is a really odd twist given to this doctrine, which is that although we'll all be speaking Hebrew as it is or was, they're a little wishy-washy on whether we're going to be speaking modern Hebrew, post-Tower of Babel, or original Hebrew as in the Garden of Eden. But either way, we'll be speaking Hebrew for sure. But even though Hebrew has always been written with Hebrew letters, a Hebrew alphabet, that's not going to be how we're writing Hebrew. We're going to write Hebrew with Latin-style alphabetic letters. And as we can see, there's absolutely no explanation or justification for where this doctrine comes from. It's just kind of laid out there, and that's the way it is. It's just a prophecy or pronouncement from the Watchtower Society. Now, one kind of fun little phase in this story is that there was a period kind of around the 1920s where quite a few Bible students started to feel that, maybe Esperanto is going to be our global language in paradise and not so much Hebrew. So Esperanto is what they call a constructed language. It was designed more or less from scratch by a Jewish physician, a man named Dr. Zamenhof. And he grew up in a part of the Russian Empire where multiple languages were being spoken, and he really noticed how the language barrier contributed to a lack of peace and harmony among the various peoples living there. And so he thought, rightly so, I would say, that, hey, if there was one common language that we were all speaking, well, that would go a long way toward promoting unity and friendship among everybody. So around 1880, he designed this new language, and it was eventually known as Esperanto, meaning one who hopes. It's interesting that the timeline for Esperanto's creation is actually pretty similar to the creation of the religion of Jehovah's Witnesses. The first Watchtower magazines were printed in 1879. So Esperanto grew rather slowly, but it became quite popular after World War I, and that's, I think, mainly because the League of Nations proposed that Esperanto should maybe be the official language of international relations. It was the language that had the least baggage attached to it. So it became fairly popular with Bible students at that time. They were another group who, like Dr. Zamenhof, were also envisioning kind of a united world of peace and harmony on the earth. And so by the 1920s, which was kind of the peak popularity for Esperanto, the Watchtower Society was getting into and, for example, publishing literature in Esperanto. So, for example, this is a 1911 Watchtower, and we can see a couple of things on this page. First of all, there's a blurb, little thing, friends living near Esperanto clubs. And basically it's saying, hey, if you live near an Esperanto club, why don't you go over and talk to them and tell them that Watchtower literature is printed in Esperanto, because maybe they would like to use it for their clubs, and so you could get people to read the literature. And then at the bottom of the page, there's a blurb, free literature in 23 languages, so it lists all the languages that Watchtower literature came in, and among them, sure enough, we see Esperanto. Okay, this is a Golden Age magazine from 1922, and we can see right on the first page there the article titled Esperanto. And so this is kind of a discussion of the language. And it's interesting how the article ends. Many see in Esperanto one of the instruments which divine providence is providing for the world's needs in the Golden Age. Just a couple months later, in the 1923 Golden Age, we find another article about Esperanto with the title, A Universal Language for the Golden Age. So again, another discussion of the language. And this article ends by mentioning that the Bible student author is going to be offering Esperanto classes to interested folks living around Bethel there in Brooklyn, New York City. And then a little later in 1923, in June, we find another Golden Age article. So this is kind of interesting. There's actually kind of dueling articles here. So they ran one article by one author advocating that Hebrew would probably be the global language in paradise. And then another author wrote an article advocating that Esperanto would probably be the language of paradise. So it's kind of interesting. And then before both articles, there's a short section from the editors of the Golden Age. And they basically say, well, could be, not sure. It says, our own position in the matter is neutral. We are not sure that either of these languages will be the one that the Lord will adopt, although we see many good points in the arguments presented, pro and con. And then finally, we check out the 1927 yearbook, and it had a report on the Esperanto situation. And it mentions, folks were giving talks in Esperanto. There's literature available in it. Folks are writing Watchtower headquarters in Esperanto and getting replies back in Esperanto. So it was definitely a thing at that time period. Now, as we mentioned, the 1920s was kind of the peak Esperanto time in the world, and after that it kind of fizzled out again, and it's definitely not really a player on the world stage anymore. Although I will say there has been a pickup of interest after the Duolingo app to learn a language. They added Esperanto as one of the languages you could learn, and that actually was fairly popular. I think the figure I read last was that there's over 300,000 people currently learning Esperanto on Duolingo. So kind of interesting. But sure enough, if Watchtower did eventually drop all their activity translating literature into Esperanto. And if you go on the JW website today, although they do offer products in 1,091 languages, there's nothing available in this day and age in Esperanto. So it's kind of interesting that any witnesses today who already speak Hebrew sort of have a leg up on all the other witnesses, at least if modern Hebrew is what's going to be spoken in paradise. But there is not very many of them. If you look at the 2023 annual report, there's only about 2,000 witnesses in Israel. You might think that, hey, maybe witnesses should kind of start learning Hebrew to prepare for paradise. And plus, maybe there would be some crossover where you can study the Bible in Hebrew now, and that would be kind of nice. But the Watchtower Society is kind of down on that. If you look at, for example, in the 2009 Watchtower, there was an article titled, Do You Need to Learn Hebrew and Greek? And long story short, the basic answer is nope, don't bother. And that's interesting because it's pretty consistent with what that 1923 Golden Age magazine said, the one that had the dueling articles about Esperanto versus Hebrew. So in that editor's blurb, after saying that they're not totally sure which language would be the official language of paradise, Esperanto or Hebrew, the editors wrote, "We are sure of one thing for ourselves, and that is that we have not the time at our disposal to devote to the learning of a new language. The business of a Christian is to proclaim the King and his kingdom, and it takes all of his time and energy." So basically making the point that, hey, why bother learning Hebrew when you could be spending that time doing things that will benefit the religion, the organization right now? Now, it is a little tricky because, somebody in paradise needs to know Hebrew already in order to teach it to the resurrected babies, as that article said, and everyone who survives Armageddon needs taught. So I don't know. I guess maybe those 2,000 Israeli witnesses will do Zoom classes or something. Although, 2,000 people teaching 8 million witnesses means each class would have 4,000 students. So I don't know. I guess you can interpret it in a couple different ways. In one way, Jehovah's Witnesses trust that, hey, Jehovah's going to provide somehow, and he'll just make it all magically or miraculously work out in paradise. Or you could think that maybe the organization isn't really wanting anyone to learn Hebrew in preparation for paradise because they don't actually believe paradise is coming, or at least it's not coming anytime in the next 75 years, so that anybody alive today needs to learn Hebrew. I don't know. Make of that what you will. But that is the scoop on everybody speaking Hebrew in paradise. So hopefully you got a kick out of that. And, subscribe if you like. I've got other ideas for this series to get around to. So, yeah, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video. Take care now.